Alabama, 1840. A cotton planter named James Calloway makes a wager so depraved it would echo through courtrooms and newspapers for decades. He stakes his wife, his actual wife, in a bet with a traveling showman, loses and watches as she's handed over to a dwarf slave named Monday for one night. What happens when a man's pride becomes more valuable than his wife's dignity? But here's the question that should chill you. Was this about the bet at all, or was something far darker unfolding behind the closed doors of the antebellum South? This isn't a story about a drunken mistake or a moment of poor judgment. This is about systematic dehumanization so complete, so normalized, that a woman could be traded like livestock and a slave could be forced into performing for his master's entertainment while the entire county pretended not to notice. What happened in that plantation house didn't stay hidden because people didn't know. It stayed hidden because speaking the truth would have torn apart the carefully constructed lies that held Southern society together. Before we continue, if you want access to exclusive, uncensored videos about the world's most brutal crimes, consider becoming a member. Subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. James Calloway wasn't some crude overseer or backwoods farmer. He was educated at the College of William Mary, spoke French, collected first editions of European literature, and hosted elaborate dinner parties where he'd quote Voltaire and Jefferson with equal enthusiasm. His neighbors called him refined, and his plantation, Belmead, was considered one of the finest in Lowndes County. He sat in the front pew of the Baptist church every Sunday, led prayers at community gatherings, and served on the county board that decided disputes between planters. His wife, Margaret Calloway, was the daughter of a Charleston shipping magnate, a woman who'd brought a substantial dowry to the marriage and whose family name opened doors throughout the South. But here's what polite society didn't discuss at those dinner parties. James had a reputation among his fellow planters for peculiar entertainments. His slaves whispered about gatherings in the back parlor, about wagers that went beyond money or land. And Margaret? She'd grown stout over 15 years of marriage, bearing no living children, and James had begun referring to her in public as "my burden," with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Respectable people laughed along, never questioning what that smile might conceal. The official story, the one that appeared in letters and later in court documents, was simple. James Calloway had been hosting a gentleman's evening at Belmead. A traveling showman named Cyrus DeWitt had arrived with his peculiar attraction, a slave named Monday, a dwarf who stood barely 3 feet tall and who performed feats of strength and acrobatic tricks for paying audiences throughout the South. The evening involved cards, bourbon, and increasingly bold wagers. According to James's own testimony, he'd been joking, merely engaging in the sort of ribald humor that gentlemen indulged in after the ladies retired. He never intended for anyone to take the bet seriously. It was all in good fun, he claimed. The suggestion that if he lost the next hand, DeWitt could have an evening with Mrs. Calloway. Surely everyone understood it was hyperbole, the kind of exaggerated jest that made the bourbon go down smoother. When he lost the hand, he'd laughed it off. But DeWitt, being a crude showman with no understanding of Southern courtesy, had insisted on collecting. And Margaret, dutiful wife that she was, had agreed to humor the situation for an hour or two in the drawing room, properly chaperoned, to avoid creating a scene that might reflect poorly on her husband's reputation. That's the story James told. That's what appeared in his letters to her family. That's the lie that almost worked. What made this story possible wasn't just one man's depravity. It was an entire system designed to make such horrors invisible. Belmead Plantation operated like a small kingdom, complete with its own rules, its own justice system, and its own code of silence. James employed an overseer named Silas Krantz, a German immigrant who asked no questions and kept meticulous records of everything except what happened in the main house after dark. The plantation had a separate building called the Entertainment Hall, ostensibly for hosting harvest celebrations and community dances, but slaves knew it by another name, the Wagering House. This wasn't unique to Belmead. Throughout the Black Belt region, Wealthy planters had created a network of private spaces where they could engage in activities that would scandalize their church congregations, gambling for human stakes, forcing slaves to fight for entertainment, and worse. Legal documents from the period show a pattern. When disputes arose from these gatherings, they were settled through private arbitration, never in public courts. The system had a built-in protection mechanism. If you were wealthy enough, white enough, and connected enough, you could do almost anything on your own property. Slaves couldn't testify against white men. Women had limited legal standing, and the community had a vested interest in protecting its own, because today's scandal might expose tomorrow's participant. When Margaret Calloway disappeared from public view for 3 weeks following that night, the explanation was perfectly reasonable. She'd taken ill with one of those feminine complaints that polite society didn't discuss in detail. Dr. Samuel Hendricks, the family physician, visited Belmead regularly and confirmed she was under his care. When she finally emerged for Sunday services, looking gaunt and hollow-eyed, the explanation shifted smoothly. She'd been grieving the anniversary of a stillborn child from years prior. Her family in Charleston received letters, written in her hand, assuring them of her health and happiness. When the household staff began to change, when 3 longtime house servants were suddenly sold to a trader heading to Mississippi, the explanation was economic necessity. Cotton prices had fluctuated, and James was consolidating his assets. When Margaret's personal maid, a woman named Bessie, who'd been with the family for 12 years, tried to leave the plantation to seek help, she was caught and returned. The explanation? She'd become mentally unstable and was being treated for her own protection. Every oddity had an explanation. Every question had an answer. The system was designed to provide plausible deniability at every turn, and it worked because everyone with power had a reason to make it work. Let's be real. Nobody wanted to pull back the curtain because they all knew what they might find in their neighbor's house, or their own. Cyrus DeWitt deserves his own examination because he wasn't just a bystander to James Calloway's depravity, he was an active architect of it. DeWitt operated what he called DeWitt's Cabinet of Natural Curiosities, a traveling show that exhibited people with physical differences, performing animals, and what he advertised as educational demonstrations of human diversity. In reality, he was a slave trader with better marketing. He'd purchased Monday at an estate sale in Georgia, recognizing that a slave with dwarfism could be more profitable as entertainment than as a field hand. DeWitt wasn't some ignorant carnival barker. He was educated, well-traveled, and shrewd enough to understand exactly how to exploit the antebellum South's appetite for spectacle while maintaining a veneer of scientific respectability. He kept detailed records, collected payments from planters for private shows, and had developed a reputation for being willing to arrange special entertainments that went beyond his public performances. His role that night at Belmead wasn't passive. He'd suggested the wager. He'd escalated the stakes. And when James Calloway lost the card game, DeWitt had insisted on collecting with a showman's sense of drama. He understood that forcing Monday to participate in this degradation served multiple purposes. It entertained his client, it demonstrated his own power, and it reinforced the absolute helplessness of the enslaved. DeWitt kept Monday chained when they traveled, barely fed him, and had been known to beat him for audiences who paid extra to see discipline demonstrated. Margaret Calloway was 41 years old that autumn, the daughter of privilege who'd been raised to believe that marriage to a wealthy planter was the pinnacle of female achievement. She'd learned French, played piano, supervised a household staff, and done everything her society demanded of a respectable woman. But 15 years of marriage had left her isolated, childless, and increasingly aware that her husband viewed her as a disappointing investment. Her weight gain, the result of a thyroid condition that 19th century medicine couldn't diagnose or treat, had become a source of public mockery. James called her "My Plump Margaret" at social gatherings, and other planters' wives had begun excluding her from their circles. She had no legal right to her own property, no ability to leave her marriage, and no recourse against a husband who held absolute authority over her. Then there was Monday. His real name is lost to history because DeWitt never recorded it, referring to him only by the day he'd purchased him. He was approximately 25 years old, born into slavery on a rice plantation in Georgia, sold away from his mother as a child. His dwarfism had made him a target of cruelty his entire life, beaten by overseers who saw him as defective, mocked by other slaves who were desperate to direct abuse away from themselves. DeWitt had owned him for 3 years, forcing him to perform degrading acts for audiences, to fight other enslaved people for entertainment, to exist as a living prop in someone else's profitable show. He had no rights, no protection, no hope of freedom. These were the two people forced into a situation neither chose. Both victims of men who saw them as property to be used and discarded. Her name was Bessie, and she'd been Margaret Calloway's personal maid since the age of 14. Now 26, she'd learned to move through the plantation house like a ghost, present but invisible, hearing everything but acknowledging nothing. The night of the wager, she'd been dismissed from the drawing room when the men's gathering turned raucous, but the main house at Belmead was old, and sound traveled through the walls and floors in ways the white folks didn't realize. She'd been in the kitchen house, preparing the late-night refreshments that would be needed, when she heard Margaret screaming. Not the polite protest of a woman play-acting offense, the raw animal sound of someone in genuine terror. Bessie had moved to the hallway, had seen through the partially open parlor door as James Calloway physically forced his wife toward Monday, who stood trembling and shackled in the corner while DeWitt laughed and counted money on the card table. She'd watched as Margaret fought, as James struck her across the face, as DeWitt unchained Monday and shoved him forward with explicit, vulgar commands. What Bessie witnessed that night wasn't a joke gone too far or a misunderstanding between husband and wife. It was orchestrated sexual violence, witnessed by a room full of men who cheered like they were at a horse race, and Bessie knew, in that moment, that she was looking at something that would get her killed if she ever spoke about it. But she was also looking at something she couldn't forget, couldn't unsee, couldn't carry in silence forever. Now, you have to understand, Bessie's testimony would eventually become the cornerstone of everything that followed. But in that moment, she was just a terrified woman who'd seen too much and had nowhere safe to tell it. The next morning, Bessie moved through her duties with mechanical precision, her hands shaking as she helped Margaret dress. Margaret wouldn't meet her eyes, wouldn't speak beyond one-word responses, and when Bessie gently touched her shoulder in sympathy, Margaret flinched like she'd been burned. Within days, the entire atmosphere at Belmead had changed. James was expansive, jovial, hosting more gatherings, and speaking loudly about his wife's delicate constitution. Margaret remained in her rooms, and when she did emerge, she wore high-necked dresses and moved like someone who'd forgotten how her own body worked. Monday and DeWitt had left the morning after the incident, but Bessie heard through the slave network that DeWitt had received a substantial payment, far more than the wager had been worth. When Bessie tried to speak to Margaret privately, to offer comfort or help, Margaret had grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise and whispered, "If you speak of that night to anyone, you'll be sold so far south you'll never see daylight again." It wasn't a threat. It was a desperate plea for survival from a woman who knew the only way to endure was to pretend it had never happened. But Bessie couldn't pretend. The nightmares came every time she closed her eyes. She began asking questions carefully, talking to other house servants who'd worked for James's friends, and she started hearing other stories, not identical but similar enough to form a pattern. Wives who'd been loaned out to settle debts, slave women forced to perform for gatherings, a whole hidden world of degradation that everyone knew about and nobody acknowledged. The incident might have remained buried forever if not for Margaret's brother, Thomas Winters, who arrived unexpectedly from Charleston on business 3 months later. He found his sister transformed, silent, withdrawn, flinching at her husband's touch. Thomas was a lawyer, and he recognized trauma when he saw it. He pressed Margaret privately, and she finally broke, telling him everything through tears and shame. Thomas was horrified, but he was also pragmatic. He knew that bringing formal charges against James Calloway would be nearly impossible. A wife had no legal standing to accuse her husband of assault, and even if she did, the incident had occurred in private, with only slaves as witnesses, and slave testimony wasn't admissible in court against white men. But Thomas found a loophole. He filed a complaint with the county magistrate, alleging that James had engaged in conduct unbecoming a gentleman. and had violated the terms of Margaret's dowry settlement by subjecting her to public humiliation. The complaint was carefully worded to avoid mentioning sexual violence or slavery directly. The magistrate, a man named Edmund Bartley, who'd attended dinners at Belmead, appointed a committee of 3 local planters to investigate. Their findings, delivered 6 weeks later, were predictable. Mr. Calloway had perhaps shown poor judgment in the company he kept and the wagers he made, but there was no evidence of serious wrongdoing. Mrs. Calloway's distress was attributed to her delicate feminine nature and her tendency toward hysteria. The committee recommended that the matter be dropped to preserve the dignity of all parties involved. James Calloway paid a modest fine for disturbing community harmony. The official record classified the incident as a domestic disagreement, resolved, case closed. But you can't close a case that's still living and breathing in front of you. Margaret Calloway never recovered. Those who saw her at church or community gatherings noted the change. She'd aged a decade in a matter of months, her eyes distant, her hands constantly trembling. She began drinking laudanum, the opiate tincture that was socially acceptable for ladies with nervous conditions. Her personal correspondence, later preserved by her family, showed a woman fragmenting mentally. She wrote about feeling unclean, about God's judgment, about wanting to die but being too afraid of eternal damnation. She developed a compulsive washing ritual, scrubbing her skin raw multiple times a day. James's treatment of her shifted from mockery to something closer to contempt. He took a mistress openly, a mulatto house slave named Clara, and made no effort to hide the relationship. Margaret existed in her own home like a ghost, haunting the rooms where she'd once been mistress. Now, little more than a piece of furniture nobody wanted but couldn't quite throw away. And Monday, tracking his fate required Thomas Winters to hire investigators who followed DeWitt's traveling show. They found him in Mississippi, performing in the same degrading acts. But witnesses reported he'd become violent between shows, attacking DeWitt twice before being subdued and beaten. The investigators noted that Monday bore fresh scars and moved with a pronounced limp. DeWitt sold him 6 months after the Belmead incident, and the records show he was purchased by a plantation owner who specialized in what he called discipline cases. Monday died 2 years later, cause of death listed simply as natural causes, which in the context of slavery meant anything from disease to murder by overseer. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Thomas Winters's investigation uncovered something that went beyond individual cruelty. He found a methodology, a system. Through depositions from slaves, former overseers, and even one guilt-ridden planter's widow, a pattern emerged. Wealthy planters throughout the Black Belt had developed what they called peculiar entertainments, a euphemism for orchestrated acts of sexual violence and degradation designed to demonstrate absolute power. The system had rules, protocols, even a sick internal logic. Wagers were placed using coded language in correspondence, special evening, cabinet demonstration, curiosity performance. Traveling showmen like DeWitt acted as brokers, bringing enslaved people with physical differences or particular characteristics to private gatherings. The victims were carefully chosen, slaves who were isolated, wives who had no family protection nearby, people who could be discredited if they ever spoke out. The methodology was designed to maximize humiliation while minimizing legal risk. By forcing victims to participate in acts that society considered shameful, the perpetrators created a perverse insurance policy. The victims themselves would be too ashamed to speak out, and if they did, they could be painted as willing participants or unreliable witnesses. Documents from the period, including letters seized from Cyrus DeWitt's possessions, reveal that these gatherings were more organized than anyone had suspected. There were regular participants, preferred venues, even specialized providers who would transport enslaved people between plantations for these purposes. The financial records showed substantial sums changing hands, not just for the wagers themselves, but for the arrangements, for the silence, for the cleanup afterward. Thomas Winters was not a natural crusader. He was 36, a successful maritime lawyer who'd built his reputation on contract disputes and shipping insurance, not social justice. He owned 2 household slaves himself, accepted the institution of slavery as a given, and had never questioned the social order he'd been born into. But something about what happened to his sister broke through his comfortable assumptions. Maybe it was the lawyer in him that couldn't stomach such a clear perversion of justice. Maybe it was the brother in him who couldn't look away from Margaret's suffering. Or maybe, and this is important to acknowledge, it was his own guilt. Because Margaret had written him letters over the years, subtle hints that her marriage wasn't happy, and he dismissed them as typical feminine complaints. He'd failed her when she'd been asking for help in the only way a respectable woman could. Now he had a chance to make it right, and he was going to take it, even if it destroyed him in the process. Thomas had advantages: wealth, legal training, social connections, and a white male identity that gave him access and credibility. But he also had a fatal flaw for someone about to challenge the plantation system. He believed in the law. He thought that if he could just expose the truth, present the evidence, follow the proper procedures, justice would prevail. He was about to learn that the law was designed to protect men like James Calloway, and that truth was only powerful if the powerful wanted to hear it. Thomas Winters did something dangerous. He went undercover into the world he was investigating. He began accepting invitations to planters' gatherings, using his Charleston connections to gain access to the private circles where these men socialized. He learned to speak their language, to laugh at their jokes, to blend in while carefully observing and documenting everything. He cultivated a friendship with a young planter named William Roscoe, who'd attended several special evenings and felt deeply conflicted about what he'd witnessed. Through Roscoe, Thomas gained access to a ledger that DeWitt had kept, a meticulous record of transactions, dates, locations, and participants. It was a blackmailer's insurance policy, and it was devastating evidence. Thomas also did something unprecedented. He paid slaves for their testimony. He couldn't use it in court, but he could collect their statements, have them witnessed by sympathetic white clerks, and build a documentary record. He interviewed Bessie multiple times, helping her record every detail she could remember. He tracked down other household slaves who'd witnessed similar incidents. He collected dozens of testimonies, and a picture emerged of a network that stretched from Alabama to Mississippi to Georgia. Dozens of planters, hundreds of victims, all protected by a code of silence enforced through violence and shame. But the deeper Thomas dug, the more dangerous his position became. Word spread that Margaret's brother was asking uncomfortable questions. Men who'd been friendly became hostile. He started receiving anonymous threats. Someone broke into his hotel room in Montgomery and ransacked his papers, though they missed the documents he'd hidden in a false bottom of his trunk. He was being warned, clearly, to stop. But Thomas Winters had reached the point where stopping would have meant admitting that justice didn't exist, and he wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. Let me stop right here and ask you something directly. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns from investigation to open warfare, where powerful men stop pretending to be civilized and show exactly what they're willing to do to protect their secrets. We're about to witness what happens when one man armed with the truth faces an entire system designed to crush that truth into dust. This is Echoes of Truth, and we don't look away from the hard parts. If you're still with me, if you have the courage to hear how this really ends, hit that subscribe button right now. Comment below with your location and tell me, have you ever stood up against something you knew was wrong, even when it cost you everything? Because that's what we're about to witness. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, someone who thinks history was simpler or cleaner than it really was. Let's build a community that refuses to let these stories be buried again. And I want you to picture this. It's December 1841, and Thomas Winters is about to make a decision that will either vindicate his sister or destroy his family forever. The evidence is gathered, the testimonies are collected, the ledger is hidden in his possession. Now, he just has to figure out what to do with it when the entire legal system is designed to prevent him from using it. Can you guess what he did? Stay with me. You need to see this through to the end. Thomas Winter's breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Cyrus DeWitt's former partner, a man named Josiah Crane, who'd split from DeWitt after a dispute over profits. Crane was dying. Consumption had ravaged his lungs, and he wanted to clear his conscience before meeting his maker. He contacted Thomas through an intermediary and offered to provide everything: the complete ledger, correspondence between planters, even photographic evidence. Yes, photographs. The daguerreotype process had recently become popular, and some of these gatherings had been documented, images that men kept as trophies of their power. Crane had copies hidden away as insurance. Thomas met Crane in a boarding house in Mobile, and what he received that night was more damning than he'd imagined possible. The ledger didn't just document the Bellmead incident. It showed 37 separate special evenings over a 5-year period, involving more than 24 planters across 3 states. There were names, dates, amounts paid, and brief descriptions of what had occurred. The photographs were horrific: enslaved people in degrading poses, white men's faces clearly visible, grinning at the camera. Some images showed violence in progress. Others showed victims afterward, faces blank with trauma. Thomas had the evidence that could destroy careers, break apart families, and expose a systemic horror that society wanted to keep buried. But he also knew that possessing this evidence had just made him the most dangerous man in Alabama, because every powerful person whose name appeared in that ledger now had a vested interest in seeing him silenced permanently. Thomas left Mobile immediately, taking a carriage north toward Montgomery, where he planned to deliver the evidence to the federal district attorney, a man he believed might be trustworthy. He didn't make it. 10 miles outside the city, his carriage was stopped by 4 mounted men, plantation overseers, hired muscle, who asked no questions and left no witnesses. But Thomas had anticipated this possibility. He'd paid his driver double to carry a decoy trunk, while Thomas himself rode in a separate wagon, driven by a free black man named Samuel, who knew the back roads. While the overseers tore apart the carriage looking for the documents, Thomas and Samuel were cutting through cotton fields, the real evidence hidden in flour sacks beneath vegetables Samuel was supposedly transporting to market. They rode through the night, Thomas lying flat in the wagon bed, listening to dogs howling in the distance. Someone had organized a manhunt. Twice they had to hide while riders passed within yards of their position. Samuel navigated by starlight and knowledge of the terrain, avoiding main roads entirely. They reached Montgomery 3 days later, exhausted and filthy, and Thomas went directly to the federal office. But the district attorney he'd trusted, a man named Harrison Beale who'd spoken publicly about justice and rule of law, refused to see him. A clerk delivered the message. "Mr. Beale suggests you return to Charleston and forget this matter, for your own health and the health of your family." Thomas understood the threat immediately. They'd gotten to Beale, either through bribes or intimidation, and now Thomas was alone in hostile territory with evidence that could get him killed and nowhere official to deliver it. Thomas Winters made a desperate decision. If the legal system wouldn't help him, he'd take his evidence to the court of public opinion. He traveled to New Orleans, where abolitionist newspapers were more willing to publish controversial material, and he met with Frederick Law Olmsted, the journalist and social critic who was documenting Southern society. Olmsted recognized the value of what Thomas had, not just for justice but for the abolitionist cause. They worked together to prepare a series of articles that would expose the Peculiar Entertainments Network. But before publication, something unexpected happened. James Calloway filed a lawsuit against Thomas for criminal libel, defamation, and theft of property, claiming that Thomas had stolen private documents and was fabricating accusations to damage reputations. The lawsuit was filed in Alabama, where James had home court advantage, and where judges were his neighbors and friends. More devastatingly, Margaret Calloway signed an affidavit, clearly written by James's attorneys, stating that her brother had misunderstood a playful evening and that she had never been assaulted or abused. She recanted everything she'd told Thomas privately. The affidavit was a legal masterpiece of coerced testimony. It didn't deny that the evening had occurred, but it reframed it as consensual adult entertainment that her hysterical brother had misinterpreted. Thomas was shattered. His own sister had been forced to publicly claim he was lying, and he understood why. James owned her completely, controlled her access to laudanum, could have her declared insane and institutionalized if she didn't comply. The reversal was devastating, not just legally, but personally. Thomas had failed her again, and this time his failure had been public. Thomas Winters made a desperate decision. If the legal system wouldn't help him, he'd take his evidence to the court of public opinion. He traveled to New Orleans, where abolitionist newspapers were more willing to publish controversial material, and he met with Frederick Law Olmsted, the journalist and social critic who was documenting Southern society. Olmsted recognized the value of what Thomas had, not just for justice, but for the abolitionist cause. They worked together to prepare a series of articles that would expose the Peculiar Entertainments Network. But before publication, something unexpected happened. James Calloway filed a lawsuit against Thomas for criminal libel, defamation, and theft of property, claiming that Thomas had stolen private documents and was fabricating accusations to damage reputations. The lawsuit was filed in Alabama, where James had home court advantage and where judges were his neighbors and friends. More devastatingly, Margaret Calloway signed an affidavit, clearly written by James's attorneys, stating that her brother had misunderstood a playful evening and that she had never been assaulted or abused. She recanted everything she'd told Thomas privately. The affidavit was a legal masterpiece of coerced testimony. It didn't deny that the evening had occurred, but it reframed it as consensual adult entertainment that her hysterical brother had misinterpreted. Thomas was shattered. His own sister had been forced to publicly claim he was lying, and he understood why. James owned her completely, controlled her access to laudanum, could have her declared insane and institutionalized if she didn't comply. The reversal was devastating, not just legally, but personally. Thomas had failed her again, and this time his failure had been public. But Thomas's investigation had created ripples he didn't anticipate. One of the federal marshals in Montgomery, a man named Jacob Tessier, who'd read Olmsted's preliminary reports, began his own quiet inquiry. Tessier was from Vermont originally, had no plantation connections, and was personally offended by what he was hearing. He couldn't act on slave testimony, but he could investigate financial crimes, specifically the interstate transportation of enslaved people for purposes that violated even the loose morality laws of the period. He got a warrant based on tax evasion, of all things, claiming there was evidence of unreported gambling income. In March 1842, Tessier and 6 federal marshals raided Belmead Plantation. What they found in the entertainment hall was worse than Thomas's documentation had suggested. The building contained a stage area with shackles built into the walls, a storage room with costumes and props specifically designed for degradation, and most damningly, a locked cabinet containing photographic plates and developed images. The photographs weren't just of the evening with Margaret and Monday. There were dozens more, a systematic record of orchestrated abuse spanning years. The raid also uncovered financial ledgers that James had kept, showing payments to DeWitt and others, coded references to special purchases, and correspondence that made the conspiracy undeniable. But here's what made it even worse. Among the documents were letters from other planters requesting specific types of enslaved people, by age, by physical characteristics, by gender. It was a procurement system, organized and deliberate, treating human beings as props in other men's entertainment. The marshals seized everything, arrested James Calloway, and issued warrants for 17 other planters across 3 states. The trials that followed revealed the true faces behind the respectable facades. James Calloway, when finally forced to testify, showed no remorse. He argued that his actions were legal exercises of property rights. His wife had been his legal property under coverture laws, and he had the right to make decisions about her person. His defense attorney actually argued this in court, claiming that a man could not be prosecuted for how he chose to use his own property, whether that property was a horse, a slave, or a wife. The argument was legally sound for the period, which tells you everything about the system. Cyrus DeWitt was arrested in Louisiana and extradited back to Alabama. During his trial, He revealed that he'd been supplying enslaved people to planters for special purposes for 8 years, and that he'd been trained in this business by another showman who'd been doing it since the 1820s. This wasn't a recent innovation. It was an established practice with a long history. The court documents from DeWitt's trial revealed a man who understood exactly what he was doing and felt no moral qualms because, in his words, "I was providing a service to gentlemen who could afford to pay for their pleasures, and the property I provided existed solely for that purpose. Where is the crime?" The other arrested planters included a sitting county judge, 2 state legislators, the president of a regional bank, and several church deacons. These were the pillars of the community, the men who made laws, enforced morality, and sent their children to the best schools. Every one of them fought the charges viciously, hired expensive attorneys, and claimed they were victims of Northern abolitionist persecution. And tragically, that defense worked for many of them. As testimony accumulated, the full scope of the network emerged, and it was staggering. This wasn't just an Alabama phenomenon. Thomas Winters's investigation, combined with federal marshals' raids, uncovered a practice that extended throughout the Deep South and had international connections. Correspondence revealed that some wealthy planters had traveled to Cuba and Brazil, where slavery laws were even looser, specifically to engage in activities that would have been scandalous even by antebellum standards. There were references to acquisition agents in Charleston and New Orleans who specialized in identifying enslaved people who met particular criteria: physical differences, youth, specific skills, and facilitating their purchase by clients who wanted them for purposes beyond labor. The financial records showed astonishing sums. One planter had spent over $8,000 in a single year on these entertainments, more than some small plantations generated in annual profit. The network had its own terminology, its own communication channels, even what appeared to be a primitive rating system where participants would recommend specific enslaved people or service providers to others. Letters between planters discussed these matters in casual terms, like wine enthusiasts comparing vintages. What made this particularly horrifying was the systematic nature. This wasn't a few evil men acting alone. It was an organized network with suppliers, clients, facilitators, and protectors. The investigation found evidence that local law enforcement had been paid to look away, that judges had dismissed complaints, that doctors had been called to treat victims and had documented injuries as accidents. The conspiracy of silence wasn't passive. It was actively maintained through bribes, threats, and a shared understanding that exposing one member of the network would expose them all. But here's what's truly enraging. Even with all this evidence, even with trials and convictions, society itself conspired to minimize and forget what had happened. Newspapers outside the immediate region barely covered the trials, and those that did framed them as unfortunate excesses rather than systematic abuse. Southern newspapers actively worked to suppress the story, with editors arguing that publicizing such details would inflame abolitionist sentiment and damage regional reputation. Several newspapers that attempted to report the full truth faced advertiser boycotts and subscription cancellations. The Presbyterian and Baptist churches, which had been so quick to condemn minor moral failings, remained conspicuously silent about the trials. Ministers who tried to address the issue from their pulpits found themselves reassigned to remote parishes or dismissed entirely. The silence was enforced through social and economic pressure. Families of the convicted men remained in polite society, their reputations largely intact, while Thomas Winters found himself increasingly ostracized for having betrayed his class. Margaret Calloway's family, embarrassed by the public exposure, blamed Thomas for the scandal rather than James for the crime. Even some abolitionists were uncomfortable with the story because it complicated their narrative. It showed white women as victims of the same property laws that enslaved black people, and it revealed that the horror of slavery extended into places that polite society wanted to believe were separate and sacred. The conspiracy of silence was so effective that within a decade, the trials had been largely forgotten, mentioned only in obscure legal references and never discussed in polite company. History textbooks would never mention the Callaway case. It was buried, deliberately, by a society that couldn't afford to acknowledge what it revealed about itself. The outcomes for those involved reveal everything about justice in antebellum America. James Callaway was convicted of fraud and illegal gambling, but never faced charges related to what he did to Margaret or Monday. He served 18 months in a private cell that resembled a hotel room, was released early for good behavior, and returned to a smaller plantation in Mississippi, where he lived comfortably until his death in 1859. His conviction was later expunged from official records during the post-war chaos. Cyrus DeWitt received a 5-year sentence for interstate transportation violations, but served only 2 years before being pardoned by a governor who owed political favors to DeWitt's attorney. He resumed his traveling show under a different name and died wealthy in 1867. Of the 17 other planters charged, only 5 were convicted, and their sentences ranged from fines to minimal jail time. The others were acquitted or had charges dismissed due to insufficient evidence, despite the photographs, ledgers, and testimony. Monday's fate has already been told, dead at 27, buried in an unmarked grave on a Mississippi plantation, his real name lost forever. Margaret Callaway lived until 1855, never leaving Belmead, never speaking publicly again about what happened. Her death certificate listed melancholia and laudanum poisoning, but those who knew her understood it was suicide, slow and deliberate. Bessie was sold to a plantation in Texas in 1843, and her fate is unknown. Thomas Winters was ruined professionally and socially. His law practice collapsed. His Charleston family disowned him, and he spent his remaining years working as a clerk in New Orleans. He died in 1871, poor and forgotten, his grave marked only with initials. Before his death, he donated all his documentation to a small historical society, where it gathered dust for over a century before being rediscovered. What does the Callaway case teach us? First, that systems of oppression don't exist in isolation. The same laws that allowed human beings to be owned as property also stripped married women of legal personhood, creating overlapping vulnerabilities that men like James Callaway could exploit. Margaret and Monday were victims of the same fundamental belief, that some human beings exist as property for others to use. Second, that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. James Callaway wasn't an ignorant backwoods brute. He was educated, cultured, religious, and respected. The network of planters who participated in these entertainments were community leaders, the men who built churches and founded schools. This teaches us that respectability is not morality, and that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones society has decided to trust. Third, that speaking truth to power comes with a cost. Thomas Winters sacrificed everything to expose this horror, and history barely remembers his name, while the men he fought against largely escaped consequences. But his documentation survived, and eventually the truth emerged. Sometimes justice is measured not in courtroom verdicts, but in what future generations learn about the past. The legacy of this case extends beyond the individuals involved. It reveals how antebellum society functioned, not through the grand narratives we learn in school, but through the hidden practices that polite society agreed never to discuss. It shows us that silence is an active choice, that looking away from evil makes you complicit in it, and that the systems we build to protect property and power will always sacrifice the vulnerable when the two conflict. Most importantly, it reminds us that the past isn't a foreign country, it's the foundation we're still standing on.